And praise the Lord to all. This is Oscar Terrazas, and I've decided to do a current presentation on the update of the possibility and of the third temple of God. I'm going to be connecting some dots as far as where it started, where it opened, and then recent events that caused me to go ahead and put this presentation together. And if you want to see some of my other presentations, I do make reference to them here in this presentation, and it would be under YouTube under Oscar John Terrazas, and I have several of them there that you can look up in case I reference them, and you need to check up and get your prophecy up to date. So let's get right with the program and get you going to the possibility of a soon coming third temple, which would be one of the signs then that would be completed for us to see the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, prophecy as far as the third temple is an indirect reference. We find in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 about the son of perdition, and it says there in verse 4, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God. Well, in order for the Antichrist, of course, to sit in the temple of God, there has to be a temple of God. And we know for the last 2,000 years, there's been no temple of God ever since Titus destroyed it. Then the other verse that we look at is in the famous Revelation 13, the mark of the beast, the 666. And of course it says there that he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, which more than likely is reference to the physical tabernacle that would be here on earth, where Jesus Christ will enter his tabernacle. So here is the political controversy in that some believe that the temple needs to be built now. There's one set. And the other ones believe no, that Jesus Christ will build that temple. And then there's others that believe that that the temple could be coming soon for other reasons, and I'll cover that also. So let me start at the very beginning here, sort of the beginning. Israel became a nation in May 14th, 1948. Mark that date down. I'll reference it later on. So that Israel has not had a national place of worship since 70 AD, when General Titus went in, destroyed the temple to the ground, not one stone laid upon another, fulfilling the prophecy of Jesus Christ. And a little side note, you can check this on one of my other presentations. Christian Pentecost at that time, in that year, was May 16th, 1948. Now, Jewish Pentecost, which runs on a different calendar, was actually June 13th. But that year was a Jewish leap year, meaning there was 13 months in the year. So if you take away 30 days, because of the system that they use, then really the nation of Israel was born right at Pentecost, the celebration of Jewish Pentecost, which I find quite fascinating. Then we go to Qumran. This is going to be an important event because of other discoveries that were made, and so I bring you to how Qumran came about. In February 1947, 1 year before Israel became a nation, then there was a young boy, a Bedouin boy, that was tending the goats up on the hills through a rock. He heard some crashes. Turned out they were clay jars. He found scrolls that are now called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then in April, right around Passover, his father takes the scrolls to possibly sell them to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem. I think he only got $30 out of it. Later on, these would be sold for like $240,000 and would cause then an archaeological wave to come into the area of Qumran. Anyway, he went to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. I found that fascinating. Most of the scrolls were written on papyrus. And as you see here, it's quite a dry area, a good area to preserve things. But after 2,000 years, these scrolls became very important to confirm that we have the Old Testament as we knew it and as we have it today. So here then the scholars now kept these scrolls in translation and examination close to 40 years, until finally complaints and gripes and everything else give us the scrolls, oh, this is the end of Christianity, oh, this will prove the Bible is wrong. Instead of prove the Bible was right. As far as the Old Testament, this was like 600 years before the current, the last Bible that we had intact, the last Old Testament that we had intact. And so this would put it 600 years before that, somewhere around 200 BC probably, that it showed that what we have in the Old Testament is accurate, 99% accurate. There was a couple of things that were off, and we don't have the book of Esther, but we had the complete Old Testament there, and it just took a long time for politics and scholars to release these books. Well, eventually there was 11 caves that were found. They're working on the 12th now. And on the third cave, they saw a wall that was obviously a patch job. They broke through the wall, and they found 2 copper scrolls. They were in fear of unraveling them. And so what they did was they set them in the museum in Jordan. And they sat around again for 40 years till somebody was interested enough in Israel to say, you know what, we need to try and take these apart and see what is written on them. They could see there was letters on them, and so they did. They found a metallurgist in England that slowly cut the pieces like a jelly roll and unraveled them, and they were able then to work on translating what was there. What did they discover? Well, they discovered that there was more than likely in code, and it has no point of origin, but sort of a treasure map of the articles of the temple, believe it or not. And I'll show you some examples in just a little bit. So this brought on a man by the name of Vendell Jones. Yep, that's where they got Indiana Jones from. This guy was sort of a self-made explorer of biblical antiquities, an amateur archaeologist, and he began to translate them as other scholars translated them, and they became known as the Copper Scrolls. So now, through all of that, he believed that most of the references in the Copper Scrolls were to the area of Qumran, that more than likely temple treasures were there. Well, Vendell Jones went out of favor. He was no longer allowed to dig in excavations there in Israel, and he passed away in 2010. So the man who picked up the mantle now was a man by the name of Jim Barfield. He was a retired fire department investigator in Kansas, and wrote a book called The Copper Scroll Project. You can look it up, support his work. So now he spends the next 10 years of his life trying to go through political moves and the Department of Antiquities and showing his theory, because he feels that he then has decoded what's written in the Copper Scrolls and where they can be located, to the point where he got an ancient map of Jerusalem. And when you shrink it down, that it matches the areas and the foundations of Qumran. And he used that, and he wanted to prove then that what then he found. And many of the Department of Antiquities and the other Parks and Recreation and everything else, and there's boundaries and lines, and it's quite complicated. And they said, you know what, I think you're onto something. They believed him, but they really didn't want to dig there. And they did have one excavation project, but they just sort of just moved dirt around a little bit and didn't get to where, sort of frustrated Jim Barfield. And he goes on then to eventually find a politician that sort of did it behind Israel's back, or the Department of Antiquities' back. And he then gets a metal detector that will detect up to 20 feet underground. And he actually discovered some metal that was there, but then wasn't allowed to dig. So that's another story. In any case, where some of them are basing some of their evidence on was from the book of Maccabees. And Maccabees is an apocryphal book. It's not in our Bible. It wasn't the original Bibles that came out during the time of King James. It's also in the Catholic Bible. But this one is really historical. There's no controversy really about it. It's just a historical writing. And what's interesting is 2 Maccabees chapter 2. And it says, the tent of the meeting at the ark should go with him. Then he went away to the mountain from the top of which Moses saw God's promised land. When he reached the mountain, Jeremiah found a cave dwelling. He carried the tent, the ark, and the incense altar into it, and then blocked up the entrance. Some of his companions came to mark out the way, but they were unable to find it. When Jeremiah learned of this, he reprimanded them. The place shall remain unknown, he said, until God finally gathers his people together and shows mercy to them. So as we know, the mountain of God was Mount Nebo, Deuteronomy chapter 34. And it even says there in verse 1 that it was over against Jericho. Jericho is just north of Qumran. I'll show you a map. And Mount Nebo then is to the east of Qumran, and Jerusalem is to the west of Qumran. So in any case, here are the copper scrolls. You can see a little bit of how they undid them, and piece by piece. And so what I want to do is just read you one part so you can get a flavor of sort of the coding that was being done. So this would be from Copper Scroll at column 5, line 12 to 14, and column 6, line 1. Quote, in the tomb which is in the river of the Dome, in the coming from Jericho to Sukkah, dig 5 cubits like this. Entrances viewing east, 6:11 says, inside is the complete tabernacle. On the side westward, dig cubits 17, and it goes on and on. So you can see you got all this, but there's no point of origin as to where to start. And so that's the reason that you get Vendell Jones, and then you get Jim Barfield, and other scholars have attempted to say, well, it's here, it's there, and what have you. So in any case, let me show you a little map of where this is all going to. And there to the left you see Jerusalem. I drew a straight line to Mount Nebo to the right. Up north is Jericho, and then south would be Qumran. And it notes then that there was this side of Jordan in Joshua 18, and it then maps this area where Jeremiah could have fled from the time of the Babylonian conquest under Nebuchadnezzar, and his fleeing with possibly the Ark of the Covenant, various articles, and some now believe that he stopped on the way and buried some of this stuff there at Qumran. And that gives you a little bit of structure and pictures. You can picture a little bit better. So let me introduce another thing that's happening among the "We Want the Third Temple" crowd. And that the scripture notes the tabernacle of David, 2 Samuel 6:17, and they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in his place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. So before then the structure of stone that Solomon built, David was not allowed to build the permanent structure, so he set up a tent. And there's actual Jews that believe that the tabernacle of David, this tent, still exists. And they could bring back the tabernacle of David, and if they got the ark, which some say they do have, that they have the ark, they would need to house it somewhere while the third temple is being built. So that is also in the plans. Of course, we have the Tabernacle of Solomon. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel, 1 Kings 8, and that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David. In other words, out of the tabernacle of David, they would bring the ark up now that the permanent structure was built. And if you follow the temple codes at all, and for some of you that don't know or have never studied, I do have a video on it, and it's known as the Bible codes, and it's explained as equal distance skip lettering. To explain it real quick, in other words, if you were to write a letter, say 100 words, and you were required as you wrote this letter to someone that you love, that every 10th letter spelled the word love. In other words, 10 letters L, 10 letters O, 10 letters V, 10 letters E, and throughout this 100-word document. So that's really what it was, and it gets quite involved. But in this case, we now have computer programs. I happen to have a computer program of this, or had it until everything was updated, and I never bought an updated version. So somebody in this Bible code organization, and there's various of them, researchers, went ahead and put copper into the Bible code Bible program. And here is then the schematic or the matrix of it. It has an equal script letter distance of 5,812 words. It goes from Genesis 1:1 to Exodus 18 verse 2. And what's interesting in this is what it's found. So the word copper is right there in the middle. You see the red column going up and down. That is the word copper. Right below it in the blue is the word temple. And in it, coming across the last letter of copper, is the word scrolls. And then you find other words in this matrix. So once you establish the matrix with a base word, then you find words that relate to it without changing the matrix. Really quite involved. But in any case, we've got ark, covenant, cherubim, veil, frankincense, ephod, treasure, map, valley of the king, Jordan, Jeremiah is in this matrix spelled out. Up at the top, you will see those 5 sort of brownish letters, and that spells Elohim. Down at the bottom, right of center, the very last line, spells the word Messiah. All within this matrix of dealing with the copper scroll. So they're very interested also in this copper scroll. Well, the other ones that are interested is the Sanhedrin. Out of various newspapers that I show and explain that it's not me, it's also the secular newspapers, you could say. And they're saying finally Israel is calling for the third temple to replace the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now that's sort of important because archaeologists have always pointed to the fact that the temple should be built over the Dome of the Rock. They're looking south on the Temple Mount. They're looking for it on the mosque. And I'll get into that a little bit more. The other thing that's been going on is earthquake activity. Now, of course, we know that Jerusalem in this area is on an earthquake fault in the first place. But there's been more earthquake activity that has been going on. Even very recently, there's been more shakes that is going on because there's some that believe that, well, the way that we'll get the third temple is God will create an earthquake, the Dome of the Rock will come tumbling down, and that'll open up for us to go in and build the temple. A little simplistic. I'm sure that the Nation of Islam would have some things to say. But what I did was I brought up an earthquake map. And so in this map, all those little yellow dots that you see is just 1 year of tremors that have happened in the area. Just 1 year. We're not talking about 10 years or whatever. We're just talking recently last year. And the orange dot that you see there sort of center, and there's another yellow dot, a heavier golden dot there, have been the ones that have been over 4.0. In fact, on May 14th of this year, recently, there was a 4.7 in the Mediterranean Sea right off of the coast, right off of Jerusalem. So we have earthquake activity, which is quite interesting also, that is happening in the area. Now, there's some Muslims that, of course, are against all of this. Just like there's Jews that are against this building of the third temple, believe it or not. And there's the article there from the Jerusalem Post. But there's another Islamic group that is interested in having a conversation with Christians and Jews about the third temple. Well, why would Islam be interested in having a third temple? An Israeli Today newspaper, the Muslim looking forward to the third temple. Well, that's because there's a sect of Islam, one of the major sects, in which they believe that the 12th Imam will come to bring in the last days, and right before the coming of the 12th Imam will be Jesus Christ, will come to negotiate with Israel and the Christians, so that Islam now will come in as the true religion before the temple of God. So there's Muslims that are saying, well, yeah, let's help them out. Let's go ahead and have this third temple. It'll just bring in the 12th Imam. Interesting how Muhammad is not coming back before the 12th Imam, but Jesus is coming back. I don't know exactly how that works, but nonetheless, I said it correctly. Then, because of this, then once again, we're looking south on the Temple Mount. And out of an Arabic newspaper came, Israeli plan to divide Al-Aqsa has begun. That they feel that there's movement among the religious Jews that they want to take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to rebuild their temple. And they're not the only ones, but also there is world nations that are calling for the third temple. Brazil just elected a very conservative Christian Pentecostal president, and he's pro-Israel. He said, yeah, let's support the building of the third temple. There's even a Pentecostal church, a quite large movement called the Universal Church, that built a structure modeled after Professor Rittmeyer's model of Solomon's Temple. Of course, this one is huge. The Solomon's Temple was, 30 by 60 cubits, and so diminutive in size compared to what they built, because they built a building that replicated Solomon's Temple but would fit 10,000 people. But everything has been replicated because they feel that it's the coming. And I'll speak about Professor Rittmeyer, and then he's one of the ones that's working with the Temple Institute, who carries a lot of weight and credibility that the Temple of God should be over the Dome of the Rock. But we'll get into that, and I'll talk about that as far as it. Even we have a convert to Christianity who supposedly God appeared to him, and he was Hinduist, and he actually gave a conference in Tanzania at the Prophetical Conferences of Tanzania in 2018, in which he spoke about the coming third temple, that it would be very soon. And so even he now sees it, that there is a third temple that's coming, and it can be very, very soon. Well, the other one that we see is in breaking news and Israeli news, is they reported now that the Sanhedrin, and I'll talk about them, that the Sanhedrin now has asked President Trump and even Putin to encourage the building of the third temple. And what I found fascinating was, and I'll speak about President Trump, but was Putin, because in the article it quoted this. During Putin's third official visit to Jerusalem in 2012, Putin had a late night visit to the Western Wall, the Kotel. And when he arrived at his holy site, the Russian leader stood in silence for several minutes, offering up a ceremonial prayer or a personal prayer, after which he read psalms from a Russian Hebrew prayer book. Then an Israeli bystander called out to him in Russian, and he said, "Welcome, President Putin." And Putin approached the man who explained the importance of the Temple Mount and the Jewish temple. And he was quoted then that this Orthodox Jew, in speaking to President Putin, reported that Putin responded this way: "That's exactly the reason I came here, to pray for the temple to be built again." Wow. So President Putin, that land of the north, Gog and Magog, would like to see the temple built again. Quite an interesting quote. And the other thing that has been going on is there's been more activity by the temple faithful, and then also with the support of the Temple Institute. And there's several organizations that are gathering monies for this. And several years ago, they actually took a lamb and came up to the walls of the old city and sacrificed a lamb. In fact, there was a lamb that was sacrificed first on the Mountain of Olives. Of course, it's not supposed to be there. We know that. But in symbolism, it's quite interesting that they're now getting away with actually sacrificing a lamb and shedding blood. Well, this time they came a little closer. They came up to the walls of the old city. And of course, there was a protest, and what are you doing? And you're sacrificing and everything else. But even in 2018, they came very close, and they actually sacrificed a lamb at the walls of the old city, dressed in Jewish garb, the kosher, the dress, the method, and everything else. And they came up to the city walls to do it. And then now, just last year, they finished the construction of the brazen altar, where sacrifices were to be made on the coming third temple. That's right. So it's on YouTube. You can look it up and find it. They had the menorah that's according to Jewish law and what it's supposed to, the size and everything that would be in the third temple. The Sanhedrin have blessed it and they recognize it, and also the altar and the burnt wood that they put upon it. So they have really come into play now and closer that they want their third temple. So where did President Trump get into all of this? Well, as I mentioned, Israel became a nation in 1948. 70 years later, then in 2018, we have then a celebration, an anniversary. Jeremiah 25, "And this whole Israel shall be in desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Again in Jeremiah 29, "For thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word towards you in causing you to return to this place." So here it is, the symbolism, okay, get the symbolism, is that 70 years ago Israel becomes a nation, 70 years last year, then now we have this celebration of the nation of Israel. Trump recognizes the capital of Jerusalem as the capital, and these then that want the third temple see Trump as a type of Cyrus the king. That's right. Not in the sense of really being a king, but in type that he now could see 70 years the coming of the third temple. So they made a commemorative coin there in the lower left side. I actually went and bought one. You can get one at Amazon. is the brass one. That's the cheapest one. They also made them in gold. I couldn't afford that one. It'd be nice to have, but nonetheless, they made one in brass. And you can see there's a menorah on top of the coin. To the left is the symbol of Persia. To the right is the symbol of the United States. And the two faces are Cyrus and Donald Trump. And the inscription written around in Hebrew and English is, "For he has charged me to build him a temple." And so that's the commemorative coin. That's what they're seeing. They feel that Trump is fulfilling prophecy and bringing about the third temple. So our envoy and ambassador went and they gave him a commemorative picture. And it became quite scandalous. The picture became quite scandalous because what it was a airplane shot of the Temple Mount and the old city of Jerusalem. And the reason it was scandalous is I will show you a blow-up of this picture, and I have two arrows pointing at it, is that the mosque and the Dome of the Rock is missing in the picture. Somebody photoshopped it out. Instead, what you have at the mosque area, again the mosque, not the dome, is a model of the third temple to an empty area. There's just nothing there. And that was a scandal, and of course our ambassador said, "Oh, I didn't know, I didn't realize," and everything. But when they handed the picture there, that was sort of the scandal that was going on. Along with, in 2014, the Sanhedrin established also a synagogue, which is under the Temple Mount. And they made a council of 70. They have 70 chairs there. This is the area where Pompeo, our ambassador, received that picture. And they did one more thing. You can see there in the forward picture. And they showed him an architectural model city, or a model area of the third temple. They have it already built. They know that the structure is going to go up. They feel that God is going to open the doors for them to rebuild the third temple. So let's go on to the different theories. I show you this graphic so you can sort of get a flavor for it. The bottom of the picture is south. To the right is east. And so obviously north is up. And you see the Dome of the Rock. Well, the first arrow to the left is the Dome of Tablets or Spirits. This is where Professor Asher Kaufman first made his theory that he lined up with the East Gate that we currently have and said, no, to line up with the East Gate, it has to be here. And then the second arrow to the left is the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, right beneath, to the side of the Dome of the Rock. And then at the bottom then is the mosque that's there. And there's many now that believe on this arrow that you see just to the right of the mosque would be where they now believe the temple should be. Now that's important because this is what that other article I showed you in that newspaper is. They're thinking they could divide the Temple Mount if somebody would just give us a little bit of peace, and between the Muslims and Israel, they could start building their temple. So let me show you a little bit of what Kaufman, what he had it. The picture to the right then, that red outline would be where the temple would be, sort of the artist's rendition, as you can see on the right side. And the upper arrow in the middle, that would be the East Gate. Notice how it sort of lines up with the East Gate. And then the next arrow down would point to the Dome of the Rock, and the arrow at the bottom would point to the mosque. So this is where Kaufman had it lined up. But we know this. In the 1967 war, several bombs exploded by the East Gate. And what they discovered is that there was another East Gate under the East Gate. So we know that the East Gate that we have is not the original East Gate. So now here comes the controversy. Maybe the East Gate is not the East Gate. That maybe the East Gate was somewhere else. And so this is now where Rittmeyer comes in. And Rittmeyer wrote an extensive book. I read his book, very scholarly, backed up by the Temple Institute, a lot of politics involved. Everybody's pointing, no, look over here, no, look over there, don't look there, look over here. I got the scholar, you got the scholar, we all got the scholar, and this is going on. And so what you see there then is where Rittmeyer would have it. And the top of it then is east. So in other words, the bottom of it is facing west, and the top of it would be facing east. And that would be pointing out, and it doesn't point to the current East Gate, but it does point to the Mountain of Olives, but it doesn't point to the East Gate. So there's where some of the controversy also lies, that maybe Rittmeyer doesn't have it correct either. So let me go to the other theory. Then there's various groups now that are supporting this theory. And these two gentlemen are standing at the Mountain of Olives. I've been there several times, and there's areas where you can stand and look over the old city of Jerusalem. So on the very right-hand side, the upper right-hand side, that's the Dome of the Rock. And on the left side, underneath Lost Temple Mount, they sort of put an artist, a little Photoshop over it. And that's the southern end of the Temple Mount. I'll show you a couple more photos. But that's the southern end of the Temple Mount where they believe the temple was, which is the area of the mosque and not the Dome of the Rock. Let me show you another one. The picture to the right and up, this is an artist's rendition now that they're making, and to the left of it is where the Temple of God would be, and then right below that is the East Gate. Notice how far it would be from the current East Gate, and that the upper right hand area would be where the Antonia fortress would be, obviously because it would be much bigger in order to house 5,000 soldiers. And so this is the reason that some believe that it can't be at the Dome of the Rock, and the Antonia fort that currently stands probably wouldn't house more than 500 people at the very most. And the lower right hand picture again shows you south is at the bottom, east is to the right. You're looking through the city of David up to the southern wall where the mosque would be, and this is where they've now done more digging around the Gihon spring. And the argument is that you would need water for all the blood and the sacrifices, and so that more than likely the temple should be closer to the Gihon spring, closer to a source of water. And I've read the different arguments on all the other sides, and there's now many that are saying, no, this is really where it should be. Let me give you another rendition of this. Here I got a little bit further out, and again, this is looking from the south. The south would be at the bottom. To the right of the picture would be east. So there about the center is the mosque, and then you could see the Dome of the Rock, which really would be about a good 100 yards from the mosque to the temple, maybe not quite 100 yards. I've walked it. And the area where it says Temple Mount is where the possibility of that temple being without disturbing the Dome of the Rock. In other words, if we could just get enough peace to split the Temple Mount in half, everybody would be happy. The Jews would be happy, Islam would be happy, and on it goes. Let me give you one more graphic. Here's the mosque. There is in the middle. I pointed an arrow on the left side, and then the arrow that's on the right side is where they think the Temple Mount would be. And you can see the Dome of the Rock over to the right. Now you can see a little bit of distance and see actually how much distance there is. And there's been all kinds of archaeological digs, and they've been digging underneath, and all kinds of rumors coming out. Even Vendell Jones has claimed that he's discovered where the ark is. Believe it or not believe it, here we go. We got all this, and they're trying to keep it politically quiet. They don't want to disturb Islam, the Muslims, and there's riots every time on the Temple Mount something comes up, and so on and on it goes. Nobody's allowed to pray on the temple, go up there, and it just goes around and around in circles. But you can see then the movement, the mentality, the spiritual awakening of Israel. We want our temple. Though, there are Jews that don't believe that Israel, the nation of Israel, should exist. That's right. There are Jews that don't believe that. That Israel should not exist as a nation until Messiah comes. And of course, we got the nation of Israel. We're fulfilling prophecy since 1948. The people are gathered back together. There's now a demanding for the coming of the third temple. So in this last graphic, I want to show you is that we're basically standing at the walls of the University of Israel, overlooking the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, where people pray. And up on top is the Temple Mount, and they can only go as far as the Western Wall. So you see there, I put a little arrow to the left. That's where the Dome of the Rock is, and an arrow to the right, and that's where the mosque is, and the sunrise. This picture was taken April 14, 2012, right around Passover. And could it be that this would be the fulfillment of Zechariah 14:4? And his feet shall stand in that day upon the mountain of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the mountain of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south. So as some believe, there'll be an earthquake, the splitting of the valley. Fresh water will go all the way to the Dead Sea and freshen the Dead Sea. Jesus Christ will return, place his feet upon the mountain of Olives, and from the east, where the sun rises, just like he will walk across the Valley Kidron, or possibly even the bridge that originally was made out of the eastern gate, where the priests would take the two goats, cross the bridge, and ascend the mountain of Olives, and sacrifice one goat, in the book of Leviticus, sacrifice one goat for the sins of Israel, and one goat that would escape to the wilderness. In other words, the other side of the mountain of Olives goes into the wilderness. And so here we have this whole picture that's sort of coming together with earthquakes and the nation and the temple institute and the temple faithful under Gershom Solomon and the altar of sacrifice now being built, and the menorah, and the possibility of finding temple treasures at Qumran if Jim Barfield can have his way after 10 years of haggling, or maybe finding the cave toward Mount Nebo, and all of this coming together in our time. How much time we got left? I don't know. I think the Lord is trying to prod us. Either way, what if I'm wrong? Well, that shouldn't be your question. Your question should be, what if I'm right?